of shorter PDF. If you have the other PDF ready, all the slides are in there too. But it might be easier for you to follow with the shorter part. Now I have to get organized myself here. And that's the start of the presentation. I just shortened it this morning. Here we go. So, because I think for me it's important to have this quickly covered so that it fits to everything we are discussing here. That's the fourth part of the social system. We discussed social organization yesterday, care system last week, mating system 2 weeks ago. Social structure is nowadays often studied via social networks, and Cedric Soer already gave you some lectures on this. But to put it in the context of social systems, I quickly want to just mention a few of the main important things here. What it is when we study social structure. Social structures are actually the interactions between individuals. Traditionally, it has been regarded as interactions between individuals within one group, but it becomes now more and more evident how important it is also to consider interactions between neighboring groups, also interactions between solitary individuals. So what are social interactions? This can be aggressive interactions, mating. I mean, when in most animals, if they want to mate, they have to meet. I mean, there are exceptions like some invertebrates, like corals, for example. Then care, showing feeding, cleaning behavior is part of the parental care system, but it, of course, are also social interactions. So there you could, for example, evaluate how the interactions between infant are with relation to its father versus its mother. And in the long version, which I don't show today, there's, for example, the example of the titty monkey, a South American monkey, where the infant has many more interactions with its father than with its mother. There are socio-positive interactions. It's grooming, sitting, body contact, or showing social support. Here we also at aggression, we often talk about dominance hierarchy, and socio-positive about social bonding. And I will bring short examples, but really very short about this. So dominance order, this is again a term which everybody I think knows. Doesn't matter if the person studies biology or not. Dominance, everyone knows this term, and everybody has heard about a dominance order. The typical example is on the chicken farm. So in species that live socially, agonistic behavior leads to a dominance order or rank order social hierarchy. So you have high-ranking and low-ranking individuals. So dominance describes the relationship between individual with a high social rank and individual with a low social rank. And for example, when you do social network analysis like Cedric is doing, then you might use these interactions of dominance hierarchies and who is showing aggression, who is receiving aggression to come up with such a social network. So dominance exists, therefore, if one individual regards another as having a higher social rank, which means regards him as being superior. And just to mention this here, the problem is, or not the problem, the point is that not all animal species do have dominance hierarchies, especially species that are supposed to be or said to be solitary living. So why do dominance orders exist? They develop because of conflicts between individuals with different abilities, or for example, different competitive abilities. There are strong and less strong individuals in a group. And by the dominance order, the outcome of conflicts is known, and thus fights are unnecessary and a waste of time and energy. Sorry, I need to get too much sun in my eye. So dominance orders are there because the outcome of the conflict is already known to the individual, so they don't have to have this conflict all the time. And if you remember the example of the striped mice I showed you yesterday, one reason why striped mice are socially flexible is because they don't have dominance orders. If two females have show reproductive competition and fight for each other, they do not have the ability, like for example in macaques or in zebra mongooses, that one becomes the subordinate female, but they will fight, and this might lead that one female has to leave, or if she cannot leave, like in captive conditions, she might get injured or even killed by the other female. So dominance orders, what you can typically see is that you do not only have aggressive dominance behavior, but also submissive behavior by the subordinate individual. And by showing this subordinate behavior, it shows the other individual, I give you preferred access to resources, so we don't have to fight over it. And in striped mice, we don't know of any submissive behavior, and this is also in agreement with our observations that we cannot determine dominance hierarchies in them. Also to mention, especially with primates like chimpanzees, it's not always the strongest who has the highest rank, but sometimes the one with the best social abilities or the one with the most relatives. This is, for example, the case in macaques. In most species of macaques, or all of them, but some more, some other less strongly exposed, we have so-called matrilines, and then we have the ranking is not between individuals and how competitive they are, but between matrilines. Here the red matriline, this would be the highest ranking individuals, the blue ones, the intermediate ranking, and the light blue, the low ranking individuals. And of the highest matriline, every individual, even a very small weak one, can dominate everyone who is below. So this little individual here can still dominate this female that is much bigger and much stronger because it gets support from all its other relatives within this matriline to be able to dominate it. And they would even get in a conflict, this individual has a conflict with somebody here, they would even get support from the blue individuals. Even the blue individuals would support the higher ranking ones in any conflict with lower ranking matrilines. And like this, because of this social situation, individuals that are born here are in a much better situation than individuals born there, independent of their individual capabilities. So that was about one important aspect of social structure, dominance hierarchy. Another one is pair bonding. We talked about different forms of monogamy or pair living 2 weeks ago. Pair bonds are characterized by social preference. That means one male prefers one female over all other females. That's his mate partner, and the female prefers the male over all other males. And by the male and females remaining together after mating, and what is this? So pair bonds are characterized by the male and female remaining together after mating, and often even during the non-reproductive season. That's not the case typically in our passerines, but in species like the black-backed jackal. They have a breeding season, especially in the arid habitats. The male and the female will stay together even during the non-breeding season. They do not only stay together to reproduce, but they form permanent social bonds and a pair. And the social preference is often assumed because you see, oh, they're so nice to each other. So like here, these king penguins, so they prefer each other. But the best way, of course, to do it would be to measure it in the lab. And what we see in the field is typically that we just see one male and one female are always together. How to measure such social preference in the lab? This has been mainly done in rodents. I show you an example we did with striped mice, but the most studies were done in different species of voles. There we have 3 cages and 2 females, and these females are tethered, which means you cannot see it, but there is a fishing line. Here you I can see it, you probably not. There's a fishing line that the female has around the collar. With the fishing line, it's hanging on the top of the cage, and it cannot move further than this. So the movement of the female is restricted. The same with this female. So these females cannot move further than this, and they cannot meet. Then we put the male in the middle, and the male might be the social partner of this female, and it's measured how much time does he spend with his partner compared with a strange female. And if he is pair bonded, then he should prefer his female and spend most of the time with her instead of looking for the other potential partner. And this is exactly what has been found in many studies in these prairie voles that are model species for understanding pair living and monogamy. And here we always have the preferred partner, that's the social partner, and then there's another partner that would be another female. And what you see is the male and the female spend much more time, but in this study it was only males, but it's the same with females. It spends much more time with the partner side by side. So they're sitting in body contact. So this is really close physical contact. Also spend much more time in the chamber. and also show only sexual behavior with the partner and not with the other one. So, and this is the case when you keep them in pairs, you pair a male and a female, and then often they test them after 3 days. But in this study, what they actually did, they gave one male access to 2 females at once, and still, even though in theory he now could have established a one male, several female situation, he could have shared his time between the female in the left and right chamber, 50-50. Still, these males developed a preference for one female only. But social relationships, special social relationships, do not only exist between the male and female of a pair. It can also be in other social groups, like striped mice. They live from the social organization in multi-male, multi-female groups, of which only one male breeds and 2 to 4 females. And the adult offspring, here you see a group of striped mice basking in the morning in front of their nest in the succulent Karoo in South Africa. And we were wondering, do they know each other? Because there's always, there can be up to 30 mice. Do they know each other, or is this just random and they just smell, okay, we belong to the same group, but they cannot differentiate? So the question is, these 2 individuals that sit here so closely together, is this just by chance, or do they prefer each other over other members of the group? Do they have something like a friendship within the group? And for this, we measured for 2 weeks. Like we observed this individual for 2 weeks, morning, afternoon. We always measured to whom was this mouse sitting closest compared to the other individual. Was it always this individual or someone else? And this here are, I think it should be 12 groups. I don't want to count it now. And we found in all these groups that there was indication that mice, single individuals, do not randomly sit next to another mouse, but that there might be some preference. And what we then did, for example, if this mouse would always sit next to the redhead, so what you also see here, we marked them with hair dye. So this is not natural color, but we painted the back of the mouse blonde and the head of this mouse red, so we can differentiate them. So what we then did, we were trapping this individual and removed it for 1 day. Normally they always meet in the morning and afternoon. And now we removed it for 1 day. We kept it overnight in the house, and we want to know, is the indication that he realized at night, oh, my friend is not here. Well, he didn't. Well, why did he not? Something happened. He's not there. And what we then found is when we removed them during the day. So this mouse we removed during the day. In the morning we trapped it. In the afternoon we released it. So the mouse was stressed because it was away. And the next time we removed it overnight, so that so the first time only this mouse knew it was trapped and kept away. The second time the potential friend also knew it. And when this happened, that the mouse was gone overnight, then they spent significantly more time with each other. Like this mouse realized, oh, you were not here yesterday, but now you're back, and there's something special happening, indicating that these individuals recognize each other individually and respond behaviorally when one individual disappears with which they have a social preference. Also, in other rodents, like here, I mean, these must be Montana. No, these are also meadow voles. So this is, it's closely related to the prairie voles, the monogamous ones, but they are more living solitarily during the breeding season. But in winter, they form huddling groups. I told you yesterday, benefits of living in groups in striped mice is they warm each other, so they save energy, and it's the same for many small mammals, including these meadow voles. And in winter, they form groups, so they sleep together, keep each other warm. And I don't want to spend this here to discuss this in detail, but what we see here is these are females, and it's the same study like with pair bonding between male and female in the prairie vole. And these huddling groups, they also show social preference, and importantly, they are typically not closely related to each other, but a female meadow vole very much prefers her female nest partner compared to any random individual. And so there's also same-sex social bonds between these females. And last but not least, and this is now much more similar to what Cedric will have talked to you about when he talked about social networks. Here we have a case study on the cougar or puma in the southern United States. where they found where they collected data with GPS collars and camera traps. And this is, of course, a species that from the social organization is solitary living. But they did observations at carcasses, so at dead animals where they're feeding, and they found that they also have a significant social network that is always centered around one big dominant male, like here male 85 and here male, what is this, 29, which has miscible relationships. That means he doesn't chase away the other individuals, but he lets them also eat with some females, but also some juveniles within his area, and their ranges also overlap to a large extent. And with the social network analysis, we can show that also in this solitary individual, they are not randomly distributed and they hate every other solitary individual of the same species, but there are individualized social relationships, like these individuals of the lila cluster interact admissibly with each other, but they reject individuals of the red and of the green cluster. And there are more and more studies coming out showing that also solitary individuals can have complex social networks. So being solitary does not mean to be asocial. It only means the social unit is one, but the interactions between these different social units can be quite complex and they are not random. Good. This was just to very shortly talk about the social structure, to see that it to have the fourth component of social systems. Does anybody have a question regarding social structure? If not, then I'm coming to, or maybe one thing just for me to organize myself. Normally, if the lecture today would be in the lecture hall, I would not make a break and stop 11:45 because you would have to go somewhere else. Shall I do it the same today? Because maybe at 12 o'clock you have another Zoom lecture and you need a break in between. Otherwise, your brain get trained. Maybe you can write me in the chat function while I give now the second presentation, so I can prepare myself to know whether I will, in about 20 minutes, make a 10 minutes break to relax now, or whether I will continue and then finish earlier to give you time between my lectures and whatever you might have afterwards. Here's some information. All other students so far always ask me this. You guys didn't ask me that. But I still give you the information because I saw I had added this last year at this lecture, and it's probably important. The question was, from what I'm telling you here, what do you have to know? And this is what Cedric wrote last year to sum this up. You have to know nothing, but you have to understand everything. So then it's up to you how you're going to manage this. So you will get, normally for the exam, you will get something like a question or like a topic that you have to write about. And then, for example, you should be able to differentiate between the four components of social systems. And this is really what for me is very essential, that you will remember this, and not only remember this until your exams, but for the rest of your life, either as a biologist, an academic, or whatsoever, that social systems do have four different components, and we should not mix them up in arguments, and we should be aware of this. And when we talk to someone else, we should define what we're talking about at the moment, because somebody who talks about social structure might say social structure, but mean social organization. And then we have a problem of communication because we talk about two different things. And now in this last double lecture of this year, we'll have a double lecture with you next year. It's going to be about it's going to be about the evolution of these four different parts, and this will again also include some repetition of the last three double lectures, because I think repetition is important. I see there's one question whether the questions will be in English. No, they will be in French, and you will reply in French. The exam questions will be given to you by Professor Suer, and it will, like I said, it will be some more general question or a general topic where you have to write an essay about. You can maybe try, if you find some exam questions from the previous year, from previous students, to have an idea. But I'm not involved in marking these exams, so I cannot give you too much information. So coming back to for repetition about the 4 questions of Tinbergen, how we can understand behavior, that can be ultimate factors, that's the fitness consequences, and that influences the gene pool, and as such the future generations. But when we look at it now, we actually look at what happened in the past. So the phylogeny, how did this evolve? So the behavior we observe and we measure, like paternal care, how much time does the father spend carrying the offspring, has fitness consequences which influence the gene pool of the next generation. And the gene pool determines which genotypes are possible, and how during the current environment the phenotype is developing. This is the approximate factor of ontogeny. And during this development for behavior, typically what we're interested in is how the central nervous system or the brain is developing, and then how this brain is responding to stimuli that would be causation. So for example, if an individual sees a pup, a male mouse sees a pup, it has 3 possible ways to respond. It can kill and eat the pup, it can just ignore it, or it can show paternal care. And in some species like house mice, all 3 outcomes are possible depending on the ontogeny, what experiences it made before. And this, of course, whether it kills the pup or takes good care of it, has obvious fitness consequences for the future. So to repeat this again, Nico Tinbergen formulated his 4 famous questions that are still valid, not only for animal behavior, but all of biology. To explain a trait, in our case, the trait is the behavior we observe, the behavior we describe and quantify. For proximate is how did the trait develop in individuals during their life, the ontogeny. And again, and importantly, what happens in ontogeny must have a causal consequence for the behavior, otherwise it would be pointless. And it means this leads sometimes to confusion between the second one, that is also called causation, which is what is the physiological machinery caused by causing the observed behavior at the moment that it is shown. And for behavior, this is called the behavioral machinery, which typically is the brain. So be careful that both the behavioral machinery, and this is why I prefer this term, has a causal effect, and the effects in ontogeny must also be causal, otherwise it would be pointless. So most people use for the second question causation, but I prefer behavioral machinery, not to give the impression ontogeny wouldn't be causal. For the ultimate factors, again, we have the function. These are the current fitness consequences. And the phylogeny, that means the evolutionary history of the trait. And what I'm now going to, and today we talk about evolution of social systems. So first of all, I will focus on the function. And that will be mainly some repetition. And then we will talk about phylogeny. So yesterday, when we talked about social organization for the evolution of, we talked about the benefits of group living that are related to predator avoidance, foraging, and something like thermoregulation, and the costs of group living, like increased predation, competition for food and mates, and like we all know at these times, transmission of disease, food parasitism, and reproductive competition. So to understand the evolution of social organization, we have to look at costs and benefits of group living. And if the benefits are larger than the costs, then it will lead to the evolution of group living because it has a net fitness benefit. And then it's the environment that determines the outcome of the cost-benefit ratio, because depending on whether there's a lot of food in the environment or not will determine, for example, whether there is strong competition for food or not, and whether there are predators or not will determine whether living in a group has big benefits or not. For the mating system, we talked about that the evolution of the mating system is that's the outcome of the conflict between the sexes, and both sexes the traits of both sexes would spread if they lead to higher reproductive success. For males, they reach the highest reproductive success when they can mate with as many females as possible. And for females, it is the production of eggs, how many eggs she can produce, that influences her reproductive success. And this depends on the trade-off, whether she invests time and energy into maternal care or into producing eggs. So for her, the best is to leave the offspring with the father who takes care of it, so they develop well, but she goes herself foraging to find more food and to get more resources to produce more eggs. And in mammals, males follow this distribution of females and try to monopolize females, but female distribution depends on costs and benefits of group living, which depends on the environment, resource availability, and that was the socio-ecological model I introduced yesterday. In birds, females are aggressive against other females and males against other males, and large territories are needed to raise chicks because typically chicks are feeding on insects, and insect abundance is not as high, like for example of some leaves or whatsoever, and this leads to pair living in most species. So generally speaking, males always try to reach copulations with any females. Females have contrasting interests in social versus genetic partners and avoid male harassment. It leads to polygynandrous matings in nearly all species. So in most species, even when the social organization might be solitary, or whether it might be pair living or living in different groups, typically we observe that every female mates with several males, and males try to mate with several females. And instead of talking about these categories, so this is monogamous, this is polyandrous, this is polygamous, in future research might benefit from rather looking on this continuum of how many partners every sex has to reach reproductive success. For example, how high the rate of extra pair paternity or extra group paternity is. And for the outcome of the breeding season, we also talked about the polygyny threshold model that has been developed for birds, where there can be a monogamous or polygynous situation for the males A, B, and C that have territories of different quality. And for the females that come and then they choose a male, they would choose always the male where they have the highest reproductive success. So that would be the female reproductive success for the first female would be highest if she goes to the territory of actually male B, and then only male A. And this is the polygyny threshold, because for the second female, the reproductive success would be much lower, and the male C would thus get the first female because he has by way the best territory, but he would also even get the second female because the second female here would still reach higher reproductive success than if she would go to this male, because you see here the reproductive success of the female here is higher. The third one would go to B, and the male A wouldn't be able to attract any female. So there's also variation in mating systems within one sex of one species. These are called alternative reproductive tactics, where individuals follow different and discrete tactics to reach reproductive success. So we can put the males, for example, in two different categories. So it's not that, of course, also in pair living species, or we have that males try to mate not only with their female but with other females. So this would be but they're all males would have the same strategy and tactic. But if we can differentiate between males that have a territory and sneaker males, and we can always say this is a territory holder, this is a sneaker male, then it would be discrete. We can really put them into two categories. So this I already said. We have the conflict between the sexes, and as we have this conflict between the sexes, and it can also explain to us why arts are more common in males, because males can increase fitness by monopolizing several females, such that other males have to find alternative tactics to reach reproductive success. If a very large male can defend a group of 5 females, and because sex ratio in nearly all animals is 1 to 1, if one male monopolizes 5 females, there must be 4 other males for which there's no female, and they must come up with an alternative, and the alternative is often to follow a sneaker tactic to have at least some reproductive success, while at the same time getting older, growing stronger, and increasing their competitive ability, with the possibility that at a later stage they themselves become a territorial male. And in females, the value of females, the value to have access to several males is typically not very high. So the competition of females for the access to males is typically very low, and that means there's less discrepancy between different females, and this is why alternative reproductive tactics are less common in females. But if there are polyandrous species like these Yakana and water birds, where the females benefit from several males taking care of their eggs and chicks, then we can also find alternative reproductive tactics in these species. And last week we talked about evolution of the care system. So females show maternal care when this increases their fitness more than trying to feed more and produce more eggs, while males show paternal care when this increases their fitness more than searching for additional mates. And there we had the example of the aardwolf to show that paternal care is not shown because it's of benefit for the mother, which some people argue, but paternal care is shown because it increases the reproductive success of the male itself. Like because he's guarding the pups against potential predator, especially jackals, when he spends half of the night when the mother is feeding with the pups. 1.5 offspring per litter on average survive. If he wouldn't do it, it would only be 0.3 offspring. That means he would have to mate with 5 females to reach the same reproductive success, which is highly unlikely, especially as they have low population densities. So for his reproductive success, showing paternal care is better, and this is why he does it, because it's his own success that's increased, not the success of the females. And we had a closer look on the evolutionary outcomes that could arise from males and females having different tactics. The male tactic can be to care, show paternal care, or to leave and look for more females. And the female tactic can be to take care of the offspring or to desert to get more resources to produce more eggs. And we saw that there can be different outcomes, and we can, depending on the values of the number of eggs laid under different situations, or the survival probability under different situations, and make predictions which outcome could be expected. And these are evolutionary stable strategy. And then, because all 4 outcomes are possible, but it's the environment and also partly the life history of the species. Life history means how long they live and whether they lay 2 eggs or 200 eggs. That determines whether this here has the highest reproductive success or this outcome here. So social structure here, how individuals are interacting with each other. Are they competing? Do they form dominance hierarchy or not? So here it's about the cost of competition and benefits of corporations that influences social relationships and can lead to dominance hierarchies. Dominance hierarchies evolve when it's of benefit for less competitive individuals to live in groups. So they evolve strategies that the dominant individuals don't chase them away, but allow them in by developing subordinate behavior with which they show they will give primary access to resources to the dominant one. It also determines then whether there's cooperation, reproduction, and parental care, and whether cooperation to defend resources and mates is beneficial or not. So social structure is of the four components of social system, the most complex one, the one that's most difficult to really define and get a grip on. And this makes it very, very more difficult to study it. And this is one reason why social network analysis are flourishing so much at the moment, because it's a new method where we can get a better description of social structure, but we are still at the moment facing the problem how to really use these social networks to come to they're good to come to understanding of what exists and to make predictions. If we change something in the social network at one place, how does it influence the entire social network? But it's still more difficult to use it to understand really the biodiversity of social networks we observe. So now I gave you a quick overview of patterns of evolution I already discussed for influencing social organization, social structure, care system, and mating system. And of course, these four components of social systems do influence each other. The social organization influence the social structure. The social structure, so who interacts, if there's two individuals, will be very different than when there are 10. There will be much more interactions than when there's only two. So this is not independent of each other. Also, whether there's a dominance hierarchy or not will determine whether they can form groups or whether group forming is more difficult. Social organization, of course, also influences the mating system. If you have one male and one female, the mating system will be different than when you have one male and 5 females. The mating system then also determines the care system. If you have one male and 5 females, the male might not show paternal care, but only defend the 5 females. But if you have more pair, then it's more likely that paternal care will evolve because it brings some additional benefits. And of course, the care system also has a lot to do with social interactions between the groups. The care system also influences social organization, the mating system, social structure. And now we can put arrows everywhere into this figure because everything influences everything. And then the question comes up, so what does this help us really? To say everything influences everything is not very helpful and very useful at all, but this is in the end kind of what we want to achieve. But because of this complexity is also a reason why I suggest that when you study something, one should focus on one component and not try to study everything at once. But now for the rest of my lecture, I want to try to show how within one species, my own study species, the striped mice, one can try to bring these interactions into a logical order from what we know from 20 years of studying striped mice in South Africa. So while during my first 3 double lectures, I try to be very general, to speak about as many species as possible. Now I have to come down and to be very specific and very specialized on my own study species to see whether this is helpful or not, this approach. And with this, we're also at kind of the frontier of science. So not everything I'm going to show you now will be totally clear and rewarding, but it just will show you how at the moment we, not only me, but many people in the field of social evolution are thinking how to bring these things together. So, but now I would like, there are different opinions I see in the chat whether we should have a break or not. So, but I now would like to make a break, but then not of 15 minutes, but of 10 minutes. On my watch, it's 44. So I will on 54 continue and then still try to finish a little bit before 12 o'clock. But I hope this will be an acceptable compromise for everyone. So I will now give you a short break of 10 minutes. If you have questions, you can put them into the chat function, and otherwise I will come back to you in 10 minutes. I see I had double muted myself with both at Zoom and at my little thing. So I have to start again, but it gives you some time. So the way to understand how these 4 factors interact, I think, is to switch the focus from the social system of the entire population to the individual, because it's individual decisions on their behavior that influences in which social units they live, how they interact with other individuals, whether they care or not, and with whom they mate or try to mate. So I don't know why I have this in here. So the question is, how does social organization, social structure, mating system, care system derive from individual decisions, and like this influence the entire social system of a population? And like I said, for this, we're going to look at my own study species, the African striped mouse that occurs in the succulent Karoo in South Africa. Here you see the research station that we are having there. At the moment, there's nobody because of Corona, so at least last month I had some South African students there. But what shows you here is there are strong seasonal differences. This here is a picture from winter, spring. It's very green. There's that yellowish. There's lots of wildflowers, and basically everything you see here is food for mice. It's like, imagine you would look out of your window and everything would be full with pizza. That's how it looks for the mice. It's all full with food. And in the dry, and it can get quite cold at night. There's frost is quite common. And for a small mammal, even temperatures like 5-10 degrees at night induce high costs for thermoregulation, so the high energetic costs. But here in the dry season, it's still cold at night sometimes, but it can get very hot. And like I said, it's the dry season, it's very dry, and there's nearly no food left. So it's very, very much food restricted. So these mice live in a very seasonal environment, and they adapt the physiology and the social behavior to this. Here you see this is a period of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We see in dark green is the spring, when there's highest food abundance, then the hot, dry summer, the normally also still dry, not so hot autumn, and then the moist, wet winter, when it's cold and lots of rain, but not so much food yet. And here you see in the black bars the rainfall patterns over these months, over several years, and the green line is the food availability, and you see there's huge variation in food availability between the seasons, but also between years. In this year, which I think was 2005, I can't even see it, or it doesn't matter. In this year, food availability goes very much down during the dry season compared to the next year. And then it goes again a little bit further down, and here too. And the last years, it was again very low. And the important thing to remember here, what I told you yesterday in the striped mouse, 1 year represents 1 generation. So the mice that are born here have to survive this dry season, and then they reproduce, and their offspring, the next generation, has to survive this dry season. So there is some predictability for the mice that in the dry season there will be less food, but how low the food availability is can differ from generation to generation. This shows you here again. I showed you this graph small yesterday, the year cycle of the striped mouse. They are born in spring. In the southern hemisphere, spring starts around August. This is the moist spring with lots of food availability. They're reproducing, and then the hot, dry summer starts with low food availability, and the mice have to survive this hot, dry summer and the cold, wet winter to reproduce here, but normally they won't survive for another year. So we have these different seasons, the cold pre-breeding season, the breeding season with reproductive competition I explained to you yesterday, then the dry food restricted summer, and again the cold winter. And I want to mention this, sometimes in summer there's unexpected, irregular rainfall, allowing for some individuals to reproduce, because food availability is increasing by some plants that quickly grow when in this semi-desert habitat some rainfall occurs, for example, in February or March. So how is the social organization, social structure, mating system, care system derived from individual decisions, forming the social system African striped mice? And we will now look at different parts of their life history cycle. And the first one we look at, because it's the easiest to understand, is the dry season, when it's very hot and there's little food availability, the summer dry season. So there's little food, but there are cold nights, and there is predation, because predation pressure always exists with the presence of especially snakes, but also mammalian predators like jackals, and especially also birds of prey like different buzzards and eagles. So the social organization we observe are multi-male, multi-female groups. The social structure is there egalitarian. There's no dominance hierarchy, no competition. And this is because, why are the multi-male, multi-female groups? Because all individuals benefit from group living by the thermoregulatory benefits I explained to you yesterday. Now, when I say there's little food, then this is not entirely correct. Most food plants are dead, but there is one shrub that provides food all year round. But the problem is this food is of low quality. It has a lot of plant toxins in it. But this means the food that's available is not restricted, and there's no competition for this shrub because it grows everywhere. But they only eat on it during the dry season or during the other season, because in the other season you have short-living plants like wildflowers, herbs, which have disappeared during the dry season. So the little food availability does not increase competition because the good food is gone. They can't compete for it, and the bad food is superabundant. But they benefit from warming each other at night because there's little food availability. They have to save energy, and by warming each other, they save energy. The mating system, there is none because it's a non-breeding season. This makes it easy to understand. And as there's no mating occurring, there's also no pups to take care of. That means also the care system is zero because nobody can show any parental care. And that makes it easier to understand. The benefits of warming each other explains why they live in groups. But the social structure, and this is trait of the species, is always egalitarian. There is no dominance hierarchy. We never observe submissive behavior, but there's also nothing they can compete for. They cannot compete for reproduction. It doesn't make sense to compete for the food. Now in the spring breeding season, the contrast, now it's breeding season, of course, they're mating, and there is reproductive competition, like I showed you yesterday, competition between the females. They are fighting they can fight with each other in 1/3 of the groups, and they can also show infanticide. And the social organization then, like I showed you yesterday, depends on how the conflict can be resolved. If the conflict can be resolved by some individuals leaving the groups because population density is low and there are available free territories. They start solitary breeding. If this opportunity does not exist because population density is high, then they are forced to remain in the group, and they're forced to remain group living. And the social structure is still the same. They just cannot form dominance hierarchy, so it is still egalitarian. And the care system also depends how the conflict can be resolved. If they have solitary living, then there's maternal care only. If they're forced to live in groups, we have communal care. That means females take care of each other's offspring, at least as soon as every female had given birth. And the males also participate in infant care. So this, like I said, depends on the environment, and we discussed this yesterday. With high population density, they're forced to be group living. With low population density, some individuals can choose to become solitary living. So high population density, we have one male multi-female groups, and the mating system is polygynous with extra group paternity. So it's actually polygynandrous, and the care system is communal breeding. If the population density is low in the spring breeding season, then there are free territories, and to avoid the competition, they have the option and they use the option for females to leave the group and start independent solitary breeding. Social structure is not changed. I mean, the social structure is then important between the mother and her offspring. The mating system is polygyn androus. Every female, we showed this with paternity analysis, mates with several males and males with several females. Oh, sorry. If there is something I don't see in the chat, then one option is you activate your microphone and you talk to me. So I've only seen now to accept Carmen. I don't know for how long this message was there. Oh, well, more than 5 minutes. So I did it now. So just to tell you, if I don't see what's in the chat and something important is, then please just talk to me. And now I have to go back to this screen. And the care system then would be maternal care only. Now we look at the situation at the end of the breeding season. What is different at the end of the breeding season? First, there is no mating occurring anymore, because if you would mate here, you would have offspring when there's no food. And in the meantime, the population density is higher because the individuals that were born in August, September, October, they are also present in November, December. So all individuals still benefit from group living. This is because of the cold nights. This is always the case, even in summer. Mating system, again, now it makes it easier. There's none because mating has ceased. Though there are still offspring from the last mating to take care of. And this then also still depends on the food availability, what happened there. So the social organization that develops here is always multi-male, multi-female. Why? Because the individuals born here, in the meantime, are adults, and there's no reason for them to leave the group. So the offspring remain in the group, and even if you have low population density here, the females breed solitarily, her adult sons and her adult daughters will remain with the mother, and multi-male, multi-female groups will evolve as the form of social organization. Okay. The social structure is still the same. This is like what I said, it's a trait of the species. They can never form dominance hierarchies. At least we've never seen it. We could never induce it. And the care system now is helpers at the nest. It's like cooperative breeding, because the offspring that were born here, which are now juveniles or adults, will help raising the younger offspring, the younger siblings of their mother or their aunts. So in this case, because of breeding, the group size is increased. The additional group members that now grew up will show this helping behavior and take care of younger offspring within the group. What happens in the summer breed, if there's summer breeding happening? Like I told you, sometimes in February, March, there might be some unexpected rainfall, and this leads to increase of food availability. And this is actually what we are working on at the moment. We do have data, but it's not analyzed yet. I think that there is reduced conflicts between the females and between the males. Let me see. Why is this? Because what we observe, but we didn't analyze it yet, when there is breeding in summer, the groups are very big, but there are very few pups. So this indicates that there's probably only one female per group reproducing, while in the breeding season, the normal breeding season, always all females reproduce, all of them. And here it seems that in the group, even if there might be 10 females, only one is reproducing. And in the next years, we want to analyze this data to see who is that female. I assume it's not so easy you cannot see it directly. You have to look at body mass measures to see which females were losing mass, and it all indicates, but not everything has been analyzed, and it's especially the old females that reproduce. and the young ones not. And while in spring, when you have 3 females reproducing, you have competition between these 3 females. If only one reproduces, then it's not competing with anyone else. And what we also believe and what we want to test is that it's the old females. I told you they normally survive only for 1 year, and then their offspring has to survive. But it doesn't mean the females from the old breeding females are all going to die, but they disappear somewhere here. And so we assume as for an old female, one that is more than 1 year old, the chance here to survive till August is close to 0. And thus, if there's enough food in the environment, she will produce 1 last litter. While the young females that were born in this season, and then they're here in the dry season, they might rather use the food resources to grow faster, to grow bigger, to have a higher competitive status at the normal breeding season when they might be able to produce 3 litters. Other aspects we want to look at with our long-term data is whether mice that are born here, how do they, how do you say this in English? How do they do compared to mice born here? We think to be born in the hot, dry season, when there's a lot of thermal stress, will have costs that the mice are not growing as well and as good like mice born during the colder spring, because growth is a physiological process. Something happens, and like every physiological process, it produces heat. And we know from studies on laboratory mice that to get rid of the heat is limiting for how fast mice can grow. And as it's very hot here, we predict their growth rate will be slow compared to mice because they cannot get rid of the heat produced during growth, so they have to grow slower. By mice born here in spring when it's cold, they might be able to grow faster. So we have to study in future who's reproducing, and then we predict if there's reduced reproductive competition, that it has a direct influence on the social organization, because if there's no reproductive competition, there's no reason for groups to split up. So social stability should be increased. And we would also have to look at who is taking care of the offspring. So this was an attempt to understand how these different components of the social system interact with each other from an individual point of view. The individuals depending on especially the environment, population density, food availability, benefits of group living, and make decisions that influence the social organization, social structure, care system, and mating system of the entire population. And thus, I think instead of putting arrows here everywhere in, how this influence, how the different components of the social system are interacting, it's more important to have to come back to an individual point of view. Let me I quickly want to check what's coming now. Yeah, now exactly. So far for today, I was talking about from the evolution, the ultimate factors of social system, about the function. And now for the last half an hour, I want to talk about what we know about phylogeny, or how does looking at evolutionary history help us to understand the evolution of social systems. And these are comparative studies. And in comparative studies, when you, for example, compare social systems in all 4,500 species of mammals, you have to control for phylogeny. That means how closely related these species are. More closely related species might show a very similar form of social organization. And the aim of such comparative studies is to compare between species to identify traits of the environment or life history that explain another trait, in this case, a trait of the social system. For example, whether I talked a lot about huddling and thermoregulation in small mammals, whether the evolution of huddling groups depends on the ambient temperature could be one question. And then one also has to see that close related species might more likely to form hunting groups because they have the same evolutionary history. And to control for this, if one wants to test whether temperature really has an effect or not. And the example I'm going to bring up here now for the rest of this lecture is about cooperative breeding. So what is cooperative breeding? Like we see in meerkats, or this Cichlid Lamprologus brechadi. Here there are groups where some adult individuals do not reproduce but take care of offspring that are not their own. These are called helpers. And we want to know which factors favor the evolution of cooperative breeding. This can be constraints that the helpers, the young adults, are forced to stay at home because they cannot go anywhere. And so benefits of staying at home without breeding in that case must be higher than benefits to this person to try independent breeding. And this is especially the case when there are no benefits because there are no free territories, and thus the most likely outcome of dispersal would be death. And before an individual dies, it might be better to stay at home and help in cooperative infant care. So high population density and low availability of breeding territories makes dispersal very costly. And rearing offspring is also costly in harsh environments that have low availability of resources and strong seasonality. And in such environments, cooperative breeding might more likely evolve, and this is the hypothesis. Then there are direct benefits. This is increased survival and staying at home, paying for staying, which has been shown in this cichlid fish. If you experimentally make the breeder believe that this guy is not helping, then he will aggressively evict this other fish. And indirect benefits, genetic monogamy leads to high intragroup relatedness and then kin selection. That means in many species, high relatedness means when individual shows cooperative care, helping behavior, it helps closely related offspring that might be nearly as close related to the individual than its own offspring, and thus increases its indirect fitness. And this has been studied in these aspects in detail by Rubenstein and his different students and postdocs. And what they talk about is environmental uncertainty as a measure of harshness. Here, environmental uncertainty resulting from climate variation is likely to be an important driver of temporal variation in selection pressures, and therefore is expected to impact the evolution of behavioral, morphological, and physiological traits, including cooperative breeding. But what we do know is, when we just look at the evidence, cooperative breeders do not only occur in extreme environments, but they occur in stable and unstable, in seasonal and unseasonal environments. And but many studies did not even quantify the Gleasonal stability. And what they looked at is worldwide distribution of bird species that show cooperative breeding. That means that there are non-reproducing helpers at the nest. And this figure A is for species that are terrestrial, non-marine. This is for all bird species. These are for passerines, so songbirds, and these are for non-passerines. So they looked at it at different levels here, just descriptively. And when it is very red or orange, then it means there's a high prevalence of cooperative breeders. And when it's blue or green, then there are relatively few cooperatively breeding species. And what we see is that it doesn't matter whether you look at non-marine species or this is total richness. This is the number of species, and this here is the percentage of species, and here it's passerines and non-passerines. And what we see here is there's not such a big variance. Doesn't matter what you look at. The only exception is maybe Australia, where cooperative breeding is quite common in. Now I'm getting confused here. This is A, B, C, D. Look, I was looking at it wrong. That's total richness, proportional richness, and here passerines and non-passerines, but it's still what I said. There's a lot of cooperatively breeding passerines in Australia, but not the other bird classes, which is already an indication that it is important to control for phylogenetic relatedness, because obviously it can be that passerines that belong to the same family are more similar than other species that live in the same environment. And if you're interested in the impact of the environment, you have to control for this, especially as typically there are more passerine species than species of other families. And statistically, they put this data that we see here for the evidence of cooperative breeding together with climate data. And there we have variation in temperature and in precipitation. So that's rainfall. And one is within and one among years, C and D, and precipitation among years is A and C, and within years is B and D. So this here is the seasonal variation that you would see in the tropics, because in the tropics it's always raining, you could say, or it's always dry. In the desert there's little seasonal variation in temperature here, but there should be more variation actually in the rainfall. That is C within years. I don't know why it should be more red here, because I mean, obviously, actually we don't. No, it's true. I mean, we don't have such a lot of variation in rainfall between winter and summer here. It often feels like it rains more in winter, but if you look at the climate table, it actually rains more in summer, even though it rains at night. But of course, we have stronger variation in temperatures between summer and winter than is here in the tropics. And here the variation between years, it shows you the predictability, like you should see here in South Africa where I work, and that's what I've shown you before. Variation between years from one generation to the other in rainfall can be very high. In some years it rains a lot, in other it rains very little. While here in Europe, there is of course also variation in rainfall from year to year, but it is less severe than in other areas of the world. So like I said, they put these two databases that are shown here as a figure together statistically, and at the same time also did this phylogenetic control. So they controlled for the relatedness between bird species, and they put these, that's important, these environmental variables of climate. They put this into a principal component analysis and made different components where they could combine, for example, rainfall and temperature variation into one component, so they have less variables. And this here is the predicted probability of cooperative breeders. This is depending on the most likely statistical model, how well it predicts it. And we see that in all these cases, the prediction is pretty good. The model was environmental variation plus the environmental average. So the environmental variation is how variable is the environment. And this means, does it have a lot of rain or little rain? And there were some biotic aspects of it, which I didn't explain here, like whether it's a desert habitat or grassland habitat, to predict species. These are the box plots here. And geographic variation is here. In cooperative breeding for passerines, A and C, and non-passerines, B and D. And the important thing, so here we have passerines, here we have non-passerines. And then you also see they put geographic distribution also as a covariable. In black, you see the bird species from Africa. In red, the ones from Australia. And you see they're also clustered together. And so these different forms to analyze the data, and the fact that the pattern always looks very, very similar shows that there's statistical robustness in the results. It doesn't matter how you analyze it, you always find that this model gives good support to predict the occurrence of cooperative breeding. Here is what is predicted, and here's what they found, and the prediction correlates in most cases very well with what has been observed, showing this model describes the reality in a good way. And what they found is also that variables capturing the environmental variability are much stronger predictor than variables capturing environmental mean. That means it doesn't matter so much if it rains a lot or little, but it matters more whether sometimes it rains a lot and sometimes it doesn't rain a lot. So environmental variability is a relatively stronger predictor than mean annual conditions. Variation in precipitation, so rainfall, was relatively stronger than variation in temperature. So it's more important whether there's a little rain or a lot of rain, the variance, than whether sometimes you have a cold year and sometimes you have a hot year. And among year variation was stronger than within year variation. It means known seasonality had less a strong effect than whether it was unpredictable from year to year how the climate, how the weather will be. And cooperative passerines are more likely to be found in areas of low mean annual and high variation rainfall, whereas cooperative non-passerines are found in areas of high mean annual and low variation in temperature. And importantly, biotic factors of body mass and diet breadth, so whether these are big or small birds, whether they eat grains or insects, had a very small statistical effects. So to summarize these results, it's not important whether the climate is moderate, subtropical, or tropical, but whether it's variable to predict the occurrence of cooperative breeding. It's not important whether it rains a lot or little, but whether the variation in rainfall is high. And differences between seasons are less important than differences between years. Why? Because if there are strong, predictable seasonal differences, then of course individuals can easily adapt to this and evolve strategies. We see this here with all the animals we have here in Central Europe. Like if you look at the animals living in the forest, if it's roe deer or if it's any birds, they have different life history stages in winter compared to summer. And because for them it's predictable how the weather will be. And also here in Central Europe, animals typically, they don't use the amount of rainfall or the temperature to change their physiology and behavior seasonally, but what they use is the how do you call it? I just said in my mind that the sunlight, whether days are getting shorter or whether days are getting longer. And this influences the secretion of different hormones. For example, in spring, when the days are getting longer, doesn't matter whether there's already a lot of food, whether it's warm or not. When the days are getting longer, most males increase their testosterone levels and come into breeding conditions, start defending a territory. And this is the case in nearly all the birds and also many of our mammals. So the photoperiod, that's the word I was missing. The photoperiod determines here how individuals will change, because the seasonal changes here so far have been highly predictable. Though I guess you will also have seen some lectures maybe by Sylvie showing that the changes in the climate leads to a discrepancy between the photoperiod to which birds are adapted and the reality that birds start actually to breed earlier now than they did some decades ago, because food availability increases at an earlier time during the year. Now coming back, last week we had in our FIND seminar this talk by Jordan Martin. I don't know if anybody of you guys watched it, but it's interesting because he applied the same approach that Yates and Rubenstein applied to cooperative breeding in many different species of birds. He applied to many, many, many different populations of humans. And these are pre-industrial human populations. So this is not modern day people living in Europe, but these are pre-industrial societies where some information was available from the Amazon, from Native Americans, and also some populations in Europe, like this dot here, which I will tell you later. I don't like it all. These are the ancient Romans, and they categorized these human societies regarding to alloparental care. Alloparental care, in this case, is taking care of human infants, not the father, not the mother, but anyone else. Can be older offspring of the pair. If they are forming pairs, can be other adults in the society that show infant care, which are not the parents. And there has been a database that categorized these, I think it was 141 human societies, into 6 categories. One, where it's nearly only the mother. This is very rare in human societies. Then quite common that it's mainly the mother and others help a little bit. Then the category 3, that it's mainly the mother, but others have an important role. So even though it's mainly the mother, she might get quite some help. Then some societies where the mother does less than 50% of the care, where she does, where the difference is, where the help is even stronger, where she only shows minor maternal care, but it's important. And the last society, the highest level, where the mother takes the infant only for nursing, and otherwise it's all done by someone else. And I will come back to this. Or maybe because I talk about it now, I will mention it now. And this is one thing that I criticize about these studies, that so there's only one society, so it's difficult to interpret it. And then Jordan and his co-workers, they kind of half the societies, that they had about half of the size of societies which I said have important alloparental care, and the other half had little or no alloparental care. And here you see the distribution. And what you see already when you look at this distribution map, what you see, or at least what I see, is I don't see a clear pattern emerging. I mean, it's not like you think that in the tropics there's much more alloparental care than somewhere else. So without statistical methods, one cannot apply it easily. But what they nevertheless found is that the probability of higher amounts of alloparental care was higher in variable environments. So where there was a lot of variation, especially in rainfall, and to a lower amount in temperature. So similarly to what was found in birds, with many, many thousands of different species, when you look at hundreds of human societies, there's a higher amount of alloparental care when variation in rainfall is high, while temperature, also like in birds, had a small but much less important effect than the rainfall. Now, my criticism of this study is, I don't know whether you realize this, but we always are a bit critical about the quality of the data. The data used for these studies are the standard cultural indexes published by Berry and Paxson in 1971. So that's around 50 years ago. So these are very old data. And they just used the data and they didn't do any quality check whether this data is good or not. For example, this society here that shows the highest amount of alloparental care in all humans are the ancient Romans. And everyone wonders, how did they come up with this? I mean, it's like they looked only at the wives of the emperor of Rome, who of course had slaves and all these people taking care of the offspring, and they were only nursing it. But I'm pretty sure that for the normal Roman citizen, the farmers, I mean, most Romans in these days, of course, still were farmers. They had to eat something. Or the soldiers and their wives, they didn't have many slaves to take care for the offspring all the time. So, I mean, this data point here for me, for example, is wrong. And if one would have checked with what one knows these days, all these data points, I guess a recategorization of several societies might have occurred. And also, I think it's a pity. I mean, in the last 5 decades, the last 50 years, people were still doing research on human societies, especially here in the Amazon, but also in Southern Africa and maybe somewhere else where I don't know it so well. And these data from the last 5 decades were ignored. So I think one could have done the study with a much better database. And there's one thing which they added to the analysis, which was not considered in birds, is starvation risk. And they found they kind of had some information whether there's often periods of famine when there's very low food availability, and they found that when there's low food availability, sometimes starvation risk is high, then alloparental care is low. And of course, one can interpret this nicely, saying if there's high starvation risk, you don't invest into somebody else's offspring. But this was not included with the birds. And my feeling is, because when you look at it here like this, there's no clear pattern. And only when you include starvation risk do you get these effects of variation in rainfall being influencing alloparental care. But I mean, it's still interesting to see that at least for the tendency for human societies, we find the same like for birds. There's 2 important things to mention here. First, they also did a phylogenetic analysis showing how these societies are related to each other depending on their language. And this is, of course, not per se genetic relatedness, but also cultural relatedness, because societies that speak a very similar language also have a very similar culture, and it shows that they could kind of control for cultural differences, which themselves might, of course, also be important. And yeah, and just to say this, of course, this also means that this is a study showing that there's no assumption that these cultures are genetically different. It shows that humans per se have the genetic capability to adapt their care system to prevailing environmental conditions. There's no idea that the yellow societies would be genetically different from the blue ones, but it is the idea is that humans have the ability to change their societies to benefit, to have the highest benefit within their prevailing environment, whether it has a high variation in rainfall or a low variation in rainfall. So it's understanding the results of evolution from millennia before, not arguing that there are evolutionary differences between these societies, which is in contrast to what was done with the birds. So environmental uncertainty seems to be important for the evolution of cooperative breeding. And I mean, we see like meerkats live in very variable and harsh environments, and also these shrimps. And in this study, that's Cornwallis et al., it's also from the Rubenstein lab, which is in the United States. They did a comparative analysis again of birds, and they here you see this is a phylogenetic tree, and we have here the swallows, for example. Here must be different families of groups of passerines, and here we have the owls, ostrich. So there should be only one species, and they put together this incidence of cooperative breeding with environmental variation, which they measured here again as a principal component. So they put different measures together, and whether or not polyandry, that means one female living together with several males, occurs. And what they found is that the ancestral environment, that cooperative breeding was much more likely, and that whether cooperative breeding occurred or not was influenced by this principal component 1. And what they found is that cooperative breeding actually did not evolve more likely in harsh environments like has been suggested by the previous study. So how can it be that in the first study they find in harsh environments there's more cooperative breeding, but in this second study they find the ancestral environment where it evolved was not that very harsh. So the idea is that rather than harsh environments favoring cooperative breeding, cooperative breeding has facilitated the colonization of harsh environments. So meaning the ancestor lives in a moderate environment, and here they evolve cooperative breeding because it leads to direct fitness benefits there. And then from this moderate environment, these cooperative breeders are more successful in colonizing harsh environments than are species that do not show cooperative breeding. In other words, while cooperative breeding is more common in harsh environments, it evolves in moderate environments and enables its colonization. So what they say here, cooperative breeding was more likely to evolve from ancestors occupying relatively cool environmental niches with predictable rainfall, which had low levels of polyandry and hence between group relatedness. And then this enabled the colonization. Again, one little criticism of the database used in this study is that the definition of cooperative breeding means that at least 10% of the nests must have had helpers in that species. So let's say when in one species there's a study that reported 10 nests, and at one nest they found helpers, then it's regarded to be a cooperatively breeding species. And that means, of course, many species are included there where cooperative breeding is very, very, very rare. And this if so that I talked about yesterday, intraspecific variation in social organization has not been considered at all. And in the meantime, there has been one review published by this guy from Switzerland. I see him, I forgot his name, where they argue that it is not usable to throw all these species that have this high variation from 10% to 100% of nests having helper into one category, and that the evolution of obligate cooperative breeders, where cooperative breeding always occurs, to facultative cooperative breeders, where it occurs very rarely, might have been under very different environmental conditions. With this, I'm nearly finished. I just quickly want to show how people, or some people, believe the evolutionary history was in mammals. That's a paper by Lucas and Clattenbrock from 2013 in Science. They assume that the ancestors of all mammals were solitary females with roaming solitary males, and then out of this sometimes group social monogamy, that means pair living, evolved, and then from pair living sometimes cooperative breeding evolved. And it's always going this way: solitary, pair living, cooperative breeding. And that cooperative breeding, for example, never evolved from groups. The ancestor of cooperative breeders is always pairs, they say, never groups. And the ancestor of everyone was always solitary living. And the problems here is, like what I mentioned yesterday, it is in the meantime questionable whether the solitary state of mammals was really solitary living, because I showed you that already the cynodonts 250 million years ago, the ancestors of mammals, most likely were social. Then they don't consider communal breeders here at all. It's like species where there's more than one female breeding per group, and they still take care of each other offspring. And evolution of cooperative breeding from group living species is excluded as possibility, even though there are some studies like in lemurs that indicates that this has occurred. And interestingly, importantly, species where communal breeding and helpers at the nest co-occur, they don't fit in here anywhere at all. Like in striped mice, we have at the beginning of the breeding season, under high populations, the communal breeding. There might be 2 to 4 females breeding together. And at the end of the breeding season, in addition, we have all these adult helpers, the philopatrics that stay in the group. So we have this combination of the two things, and this doesn't fit into the scheme at all, making it kind of questionable how much this can explain. Okay. And with this, I'm going to stop here. That I would now have continued with Sociality, but as the time is progressed and as I will have a double lecture on Sociality anyway in March, I will rather stop here for today to give you the theoretical possibility, though no, unfortunately you haven't used it the last times, to ask questions, but also to not to overtax your attention. So if you have any questions now, or if there anything I should explain again because I was too fast, then please let me know by either writing it in the chat or by just switching on your microphone and asking me. I also look on YouTube. On YouTube, there's 6 people watching, but no questions. I can ask them that too. Anybody has some questions or some comments? You're also more than welcome if there are some questions coming up after you looked at the notes again, to send me an email if you want me to clarify something. And of course, you have the option to, where is this? To go at any time on YouTube and to watch the presentation here again, and also the presentation from yesterday and 3 weeks ago. And I see at least here, I see that some people afterwards watched it again. It was from 2 weeks ago, yeah. Good, if there are no further questions, then I'm going to, let me stop this. I want to stop this YouTube sharing.